Let's talk about the fascinating and surprising history behind Joseph Smith's most famous sermon. You've likely heard about the King Follett Discourse, an oration that Joseph Smith delivered to a general conference just months before his death in 1844. Scholars have argued that there are few LDS sermons as consequential in Mormon history. It was delivered in the midst of a conflict within Nauvoo where Joseph Smith was trying to shout down his dissenters. It was a challenge to those who claimed that he was a fallen prophet. It was the culmination of his theological teachings and his prophetic career. Many of his most unique theological arguments are found within it. In fact, Harold Bloom, a non-Mormon Yale literary critic, once said that the King Follett Discourse is one of the truly remarkable sermons ever preached in America. When I did an informal poll on my social media channels a couple months ago asking for what deep doctrine documents missionaries held in their possession during their missions, the King Follett Discourse was one of the most common. It's also one of the most documented, one of the best documented orations that Joseph Smith ever delivered. Yet the text has a complicated history. There have been moments when LDS leaders and members alike felt uncomfortable with some of its radical contents, and Christians have often pointed to the sermon as evidence that Mormons believe in a different type of God. It also holds a complicated status within the LDS scriptural canon. So in this video, I hope to do a few things. One, I want to provide the background and context for the sermon. Then I'm going to do a deep dive on its contents, especially its more radical ideas. And then finally, I'll touch on some of the legacies and the complicated publication history of the sermon, which reveals a lot about how the Latter-day Saint tradition has evolved since that spring day in April 1844. There are a few points of background and context that I think are important to understand the King Follett sermon itself. First, we need to talk about Joseph Smith as a preacher. When Joseph Smith embarked as the prophet of what was then the Church of Christ in the 1830s, he was not known as an orator. It was his companion, Sidney Rigdon, the counselor in the First Presidency, who often delivered the most popular and famous addresses in public gatherings. When Joseph Smith would deliver important things like the dedicatory prayer at the Kirtland Temple, he was often reading from remarks that had been co-authored in advance. It was not until after Missouri and the trauma that Joseph Smith and others experienced there that Smith seems to have found his voice and was much more comfortable in speaking in public and declaring radical teachings. Because even when he wasn't a prominent speaker or orator, he was a radical theologian. Many of his earliest revelations challenged traditional Christian dogma, like the revelation now known as D&C 76, which spoke about exaltation, though not as specifically as later LDS teachings would clarify. Other revelations, like what became known as D&C 93, spoke of spirits existing in the beginning with God. One of what I believe is his most fascinating early documents is his specimen of pure language from the early 1830s, where we get the words like Amen God and Amen Christ, which seem to imply that God and Christ are part of the same lineage as human beings. I think I'll do a whole video on that specimen of pure language at some point in the future. So by Nauvoo, especially in overcoming the tragedies of Missouri, Joseph Smith starts becoming much more explicit on the eternal nature of spirits as a radical change in Christian theology. That included rejecting doctrines like creation ex nihilo, meaning that God creates the world out of nothing, as well as theosis being something that tears down the boundary between the creator, God, and the created humanity, blending those spheres together. Now, the nature of God was a contested teaching during Joseph Smith's day, and scholars still today debate over when Joseph Smith came to believe in a Godhead of three different personages, and especially that God was embodied. Joseph Smith would declare in Nauvoo that he'd been teaching a corporeal God for over a dozen years, but the record is a bit more nuanced, and I may do a full video at some point on the evolution of the Mormon Godhead. Some early revelations in Scripture, like the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon, as well as the Book of Moses in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, seem to imply at least some notion of an embodied God, but he may have also been using the language of what scholars call social Trinitarianism, where you see many evangelicals during the day talking about a God with body and parts, but not in the literal sense. So what is metaphorical and what is literal? It's definitely going to become literal by Nauvoo and the King Follett Discourse, because due to disputes with dissenters, Joseph Smith's radical teachings regarding polygamy, the plurality of gods, and temple ceilings became key points of dispute within his broader theological corpus. So in 1844, March 9th, King Follett died after being part of an accident while digging a well. The Follett family asked Joseph Smith to deliver a funeral sermon, though a variety of things kept him from doing that until he spoke at General Conference on April 6, 1844, where he used the occasion to expound on these broader theological concepts. Before I go much further, I need to do my awkward yet necessary pitch for the channel. If you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back. You can become a member where for a nominal sum you get early access to the videos. You also get little icons next to names, and most importantly, you get to help sustain this channel so that me and my producer Anthony can put in the time that is required by these types of videos. Every Monday I do deep dives on topics like this one. On Wednesdays I connect the past to the present, and on Fridays I pull back the curtain, talk about recent historiographical developments, interview authors of new books, or pull you behind the scenes of historical interpretation and look at the documents behind our arguments. I also strongly recommend subscribing to my newsletter so you can keep up with all my different activities across different platforms. It's free. It's a kit newsletter. You can find the subscription link in my video description, though make sure you're going to be getting a confirmation email. That email is likely going to your spam folder. You need to save that and confirm your email address so you can get my future messages that I promise I only send out every other week or so. And just to mark your calendars, on Wednesday, February 18th at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, I'm going to be helping Eli McCann launch his new book, a collection of humorous essays with signature books. 2 p.m. February 18th, a Wednesday, 2 p.m. Mountain Time on this YouTube channel. It's going to be a lot of fun. But let's get back to today's topic. Before we get into the discourse itself, let's talk about the setting. Here is an artist's near contemporaneous depiction of this general conference. A few things of note: the indigenous participation, where several leaders of nearby tribes were invited to participate. Sadly, we don't have their reactions. And also, sadly, the historical reality probably didn't have these beautiful weeping willow trees, nor all the top hats. Other remarks on settings. While Joseph Smith is delivering this in the west of the Nauvoo temple construction site with a windy setting, he in fact has to tell his audience to give profound attention and that he would try to speak loud over the wind. He is invoking a lot of Masonic ideas during this discourse that make the setting seem more appropriate for a Masonic lodge, and for reasons that I'll talk about later. He also, at various points in this sermon, is going to address both the Follett family directly, saying, I'm trying to help you compensate for your loss. You get this friendly nature where it's almost a one-on-one type of sermon being given despite thousands in attendance. And it's also a daring lecture in that he's explicitly trying to challenge Christian orthodoxy. At times he calls out the learned men and the doctors and lawyer of Scripture, specifically citing Alexander Campbell, who is a noted scriptorian in early America, who also wrote the first anti-Mormon critique of the Book of Mormon. And what also makes this sermon unique is the vast amount of contemporaneous sources we have of what he said. 4 people wrote records either at the time or shortly after. Here is the account from Thomas Bullock, who wrote in his own personal version of shorthand. Here you have the account from William Clayton, his personal secretary, who wrote in longhand. Here you have Willard Richards, who wrote a minutes-style version of notes. And here's Wilford Woodruff, who kept a record in his diary. A polished version of this account, which relied primarily on Bullock and Clayton, appeared in the Times and Seasons a couple months later. And then I'll talk about how these versions are later amalgamated into a broader official version, though not without some of its problems. The main theological focus in the King Follett Discourse is on the nature of God. If men do not comprehend the character of God, they do not comprehend themselves, he declares. This is a crucial tone-setting statement for the sermon, and it's also a direct assault on mainstream Orthodox Christianity that argued that God is unknowable. Instead, to collapse that distance, to say that if you don't understand the nature of God, you don't understand yourself, is overturning centuries of Christian theology. Now, of course, there's a radical component to Joseph Smith's definition of godhood. He taught that God was, quote, once as one of us, and that all spirits that God ever sent into the world were susceptible of enlargement, meaning that they themselves would become God as well. And I'll get to that in a bit. He argued that all spirits are co-eternal with God, using a ring as a metaphor. And here is a big block quote. God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man, and sits enthroned in yonder heavens. That is the great secret. If the veil were rent today, and God were to make himself visible, if you were to see him today, you would see him like a man in form, like yourselves, in all the person, image, and the very form as a man. Here is the most concrete teaching we get from Joseph Smith, though he had been talking about and hinting at this teaching for a few years by this point. This notion of collapsing the sacred distance between God and humanity, saying that God is just an exalted version of man. And then, of course, the inverse of that argument is then laid out, that if God is like man, man can eventually become like God. Here's another major block quote. You have got to learn to be a God yourself, moving from one small degree to another, and from a small capacity to a great one, from one grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, until you arrive at the station of God. This is where I hinted at earlier that there's a lot of Masonic imagery. This is directly drawing from these Masonic ideas of advancement from stage to stage, from station to station, now placed on the eternities, given a sacred lineage within godhood. This is, of course, the famous doctrine that Lorenzo Snow, an apostle at the time, would later capture in the phrase, as man is, God once was, as God is, man may become. A fascinating phrase that has its own history within the broader culture that I might talk about later. Regarding deification, there are other elements of the sermon that do not get carried on in LDS teaching, especially regarding infants who are exalted, those who die as children, which was a major problem in Nauvoo, like everywhere in America. What do we do with their lost loved ones? And at times, Joseph Smith would turn to the audience saying, this is what happens to your lost children. Quote, this is from the Times and Season account, which amalgamates the William Clayton and Thomas Bullock version. As a child dies, so it shall rise from the dead and be forever living in the learning of God. It shall be the child, the same as it was before it died out of your arms. Children dwell and exercise power in the same form as they laid them down. Now, this is a teaching basically saying that when a child dies as a child, they remain in that stature, an idea that is also captured in Wilford Woodruff's account of this sermon, in which he says, eternity is full of thrones upon which dwell thousands of children reigning on the thrones of glory, not one cubit added to their stature. Woodruff himself would later claim that Joseph Smith developed this theology after the sermon, saying that, well, no, they'll eventually grow. But that's going to be a key point of debate with future interpreters of this King Follett Discourse for reasons I'll talk about later. One final theological concept that I think is important to highlight from the King Follett Discourse, and that's the question of spirit birth. Here is one of the key lines from it. God found, quote, himself in the midst of spirit and glory, because he was greater, and saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest could have a privilege to advance like himself. And so here comes a division of interpreting this and other passages of Joseph Smith. Is he meaning there that the spirits that identify as intelligences, do they exist in an eternal duration with God, or is there some kind of spiritual matter that then he forms, moving from a soul to a spirit, is how B.H. Roberts, who I'll get into in a bit, frames it, and through some type of process of spirit birth? In other words, are our intelligences, our notions of self, as eternal as God? Or is God taking this rough matter of intelligences, these spirits, and forming the person? That might seem a bit trite, like determining how many angels can dance on the head of a needle, but this ends up being a crucial debate in LDS theological discussions for decades after. What is co-eternal with God? The spirit or the soul? Are they the same? Are they different? Now, the immediate reaction to the sermon was quite polarized. Some who, of course, believed in Joseph Smith's radical innovations declared that it was the greatest sermon that Joseph Smith had ever preached. Joseph Fielding, who is an early convert, the brother of Mary Fielding Smith, who marries Hiram Smith, declares that nobody in attendance hearing him deliver that sermon would conclude that he was a fallen prophet. In other words, this was evidence to all the dissenters that they were wrong. Meanwhile, though, just dissenters like William Law saw this as evidence of Joseph Smith's heresy, and when they published the Nauvoo Expositor just a few weeks later, they included details from the sermon showing that Joseph Smith was teaching blasphemy. Now let's talk about some of the reception history and the lasting legacies from that sermon. For many who were there, that sermon long remained in their mind as a great moment. Wilford Woodruff, who recorded one of the 4 contemporaneous accounts, would recall back to that sermon decades later. In fact, when he dedicated the Salt Lake Temple, 5 decades after the King Follett Discourse, he cited the King Follett Discourse as the most powerful spiritual oration he had ever heard. Now, they were able to remember it because they almost nearly immediately published it. They take several of the accounts, mostly drawn from the Bullock and the Clayton versions, and published in the newspaper Times and Seasons in August 1844. About a decade later, an employee for the church historian's office, Jonathan Grimshaw, produced a standard copy based on all the different accounts with some repetition and some awkward insertions that would become part of their official History of Joseph Smith, a serialized version of history that was published in newspapers. Brigham Young would draw from the King Follett Discourse when he would teach his Adam-God theology, taking some seeds that he believes of the Adam-God theology in that sermon and bringing them to their fruition. And the doctrine of infant resurrection was debated among several church leaders, though it slowly faded away. But then in the early 20th century, the history of the King Follett Discourse takes an interesting turn. On the one hand, you have B.H. Roberts, who is the most prominent LDS theologian and historian during the Progressive Era. And he was fascinated with Joseph Smith. He wrote several history volumes, and he thought the King Follett Discourse was the culmination of everything Joseph Smith had been teaching. So he published a version of the King Follett Discourse in the church's newspapers in 1909, and he wanted to have it included in the History of the Church series when it was published in 1912. You might remember the History of the Church series. Here's a popular collection of those volumes. They were an edited version of the History of Joseph Smith series that the historian's office had produced decades before. But after he produces the typeset and goes on a mission, something happens to the manuscript, because the First Presidency, comprised of Joseph F. Smith and Charles Penrose, were not fans of the King Follett Discourse, at least as it was prepared by B.H. Roberts. Joseph F. Smith had several problems with the version of the King Follett Discourse Roberts had put together, not the least of which was the infant exaltation part. Joseph F. Smith had lost 13 children of his own, and he could not fathom not being able to watch them grow in the eternities. Charles Penrose, meanwhile, fundamentally disagreed with B.H. Roberts' interpretation of spirit birth. B.H. Roberts was in the camp of saying that there were intelligences that God organized into spirits. Charles Penrose believed that the spirits themselves were eternal with God. So when B.H. Roberts is out preaching and he's citing the King Follett Discourse, and it says you can find in the History of the Church, people start telling him, hey, I have History of the Church, it's not in there. And so B.H. Roberts goes to the volume and he finds that pages 302 to 317 are missing. They had been taken out during the typescript form and were restricted. B.H. Roberts is so furious that he demands the church print 10,000 copies of just those pages, including the King Follett Discourse, so everyone could read them. And they finally are re-added to the History of the Church volumes when they were republished in 1952. That brief period in which the history of the church did not include the King Follett Discourse, and there was uneasiness of the church, did not last long. And there are two figures who, more than anyone else, emphasized the importance of the King Follett Discourse and moving it more toward the center of LDS teachings. One was Joseph Fielding Smith, the son of Joseph F. Smith, who did not share his father's hesitations of the text. And so he includes it in the very influential Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith volume that he published while he was church historian. Notably, the portions like the infant exaltation were removed, and the discussions of spirit birth were correlated into the mainstream LDS teaching. Then Joseph Fielding Smith's son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, known for the famous Mormon doctrine, frequently cited the King Follett Discourse as the best sermon that a Mormon leader had ever taught, even at one point arguing that it should be added to the LDS canon, though he was upfront of his critiques of B.H. Roberts' footnotes regarding the King Follett Discourse because they disagreed both on the infant exaltation and the spirit birth. I told you that those are issues that are going to remain interpretive disagreements. More recently, there has been a return of some discomfort, especially as Latter-day Saints have been trying to emphasize their commonalities with mainstream Christianity. You see, during the 1980s, 1990s, and the early decades of the 21st century, a number of prominent LDS intellectuals and academics and BYU professors holding dialogues with Christians, especially evangelicals. And to be able to show those commonalities, there's been a decline of emphasizing the King Follett Discourse. Gordon B. Hinckley, for instance, in one national interview in 1997 said regarding the King Follett Discourse, that gets into some pretty deep theology that we don't know very much about. And when he was asked about Lorenzo Snow's couplet, as God is, man once was, or as man as God was, as God as man may become, says, I'm not sure we really teach that. Though in other interviews, he does try to double down, which shows just this constant awkwardness. One of my favorite anecdotes that come from these dialogues taking place between Mormons and evangelicals with regard to King Follett has to do with my old BYU philosophy teacher, David Paulson, who's written a number of really influential works and articles and books on Mormon theology. And he tells a story of being in Nauvoo at one of these gatherings between BYU professors and evangelical professors. And he was alarmed at several of his colleagues, like Stephen Robinson and Robert Millett, who were downplaying the King Follett Discourse, saying, oh, that might be just some fringe doctrines. I don't know if it's fully canonized. And when it came around to David Paulson, he said, I belong to the Church of King Follett, that we are not moving away from it. I will always be a professor at the University of King Follett, which shows, I think, this remaining divided sense of some who exult in the radical, unique doctrines of the King Follett Discourse, the exceptionalism of Mormon theology, and others who wish that it weren't as central because they want to emphasize the connections to mainstream Christianity. Most recently, we get the LDS Churches Becoming Like God Gospel Topics essay, likely authored by Terrell Givens and held by others, which connects these broader issues of Christian theosis, this new train of thinking of, well, maybe we can embrace the radical doctrines of King Follett Discourse and connect it to things like Eastern orthodoxy and these other notions of Christian theosis. So emphasizing both the exceptionalism of Mormonism as well as its connections to the broader Christian world, which is where I think the Latter-day Saints currently are today in viewing the King Follett Discourse. I hope you found this video useful and this overview of the King Follett Discourse, its background, its contents, its legacies. If so, please hit the like button, share this videos with others, and become a member of this channel if you haven't yet. But I can't let you go without giving you some homework, of course. You can go to, and all these links are found in the video description. You can go and read all the 4 different contemporary accounts at the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which also has some good introductions to those very documents. Stan Larson, a former Mormon history scholar, put together a useful amalgamation of version of the text in which he takes elements of the 4 different versions to make one consistent one. Some scholars love that account, others don't. You can judge for yourselves. Van Hale had a very influential article, The Doctrinal Impact of the King Follett Discourse, placing that discourse within the broader context. And if you really, really like a nerdy deep dive into the textual history, I strongly recommend William V. Smith's The King Follett Discourse, a biography published by BCC Press, which is a history of not just the sermon, its doctrinal developments, but also how the text has been interpreted over time. It's a really great analysis. And if you want a more philosophical, theological engagement with the text from a modern Latter-day Saint perspective, James Faulkner and Susanna Morrison have an article in BYU Studies just a few years ago, The King Follett Discourse, Pinnacle or Peripheral, which frames the discourse in a smart way of not the final statement of Mormon theological of ideas, but rather a part of a tug of war, a give and take, a continued conversation, which again, I think is where the Latter-day Saints currently come down. I hope you go read those because they are very fascinating. Let me know if you have any lingering questions or ideas for future videos. History has never been more relevant than it is right now, which is why I love geeking out on these types of topics with all of you.